go bad.
Hello and welcome to the third session of Day 1, the Russia Seminar 2021. In the picture you see the persons, the orchestra which is conducting the seminar, organizing and moderating. I'm Pentti Forssten, researcher in the group, and here is also Assistant Professor Katri Pynnöniemi, and we will be moderating this evening session or morning session in the other part of the world. So we have been discussing today about concept of deterrence. First session in the morning was more or less conceptual approach to the concept of deterrence, and also we approached to the concept from the structural point of view, and the third one was how can deterrence be researched and analyzed from the different sources in the English-speaking, Russian-speaking areas. In the afternoon, we went a bit deeper to the concept and saw a historical approach to the theme we have been dealing with. Firstly, there was a Russian presentation about the legacy of Snesarev, classic Russian thinker from the 1920s. And then Rod Thornton from King's College explained us the essence of Soviet principle of activeness in warfare today. Now the third session goes even deeper to the concept of deterrence, and we have a privilege to invite our two speakers from the United States. And the first will deal with the notion of damage in Russian military thought today, and second presentation will be dealing with the nuclear strategy and its legacy before Sderzhevanye, as it was mentioned in the program. Unfortunately, Mr. Lester Grau, he had to skip the session due to the personal reasons. He got sick, but anyway, he has promised to give his contribution to the publication in the future. I have the privilege to welcome Dr. Anja Fink. She is a research analyst in the Russia Studies program at CNA, and the research associate at the Center for International and Security Studies at the University of Maryland. Previously, she was a fellow in nuclear security policy in the US Senate. Her research focuses on Russian strategy and nuclear issues. Her latest publications include CNA reports on Russian approaches to escalation management, co-authored with Michael Kaufman, and a chapter on Russia's perception of the 1920 strategic ballad in Brad Roberts' edited Fit for Purpose, the US strategic posture in 1930 and beyond. No further introduction. I welcome Anja Fink. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much to the National Defense University and the organizers for this wonderful opportunity. It's an honor to be here among all of you this evening and alongside experts whom I have long admired and learned from. My talk today is on the evolution of damage concepts in Russian military thought, and it builds on a report that I co-authored last year with CNA colleagues Mike Kaufman and Jeffrey Edmonds on Russian concepts of escalation management as part of our work for EUCOM RSI. The takeaway of my talk, or the bluff, if you will, is that Russian military thinking on damage concepts has evolved over the last 3 decades as part of Russian efforts to work out strategic deterrence in theory and in practice. One, it has evolved from a central focus on unacceptable damage in the context of strategic nuclear forces towards concepts like deterrent damage that reference the whole of spectrum of strategic deterrence capabilities. And two, it has evolved toward ideas of tailoring damage levels to the psychological perceptions of the adversary's leadership and society, or within a coalition, potentially starting with small levels of damage that could be progressively scaled up as part of interwar deterrence. And this also involves incorporation of subjective notions of damage into a traditional notion of objective damage. So the ideas of perception as opposed to the traditional ideas of just striking specific targets. And all of this is aimed at being able to bring to the political leadership diverse and flexible signaling and employment options when Russia is in conflict. So in Russian military writings, damage concepts can be very challenging to work through, but because the debate in Russian military institutions continues as the Russian military contemplates the changing nature of warfare, the role of non-military means, and the evolution of capabilities, it's very important and an issue that we need to try to understand and track. And so my presentation aims to try to do that a little bit. First things first, damage, or ущерб, is a way to quantify losses in a conflict to include physical and moral losses, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense Encyclopedia. Russian military planners tend to think of in terms of assigned damage, or заданный ущерб, a concept which refers to levels of damage inflicted to destroy or disable adversary targets or forces. And this level is generally assigned by the political military leadership depending on operational needs in a conflict. But if you look at Russian military writings on strategic capabilities to now include strategic conventional systems, you see a slightly different terminology, and this is really where I want to focus today. Like in American strategic thought, one of the key concepts in Russian military thought on nuclear weapons is unacceptable damage. In Russian, this is неприемлемый ущерб. It has traditionally been associated with the ability of strategic nuclear forces to inflict a predetermined level of damage on an opponent's key targets. These would include industrial capacity or population targets. And this, the opponent would potentially consider this unacceptable. So parity of strategic nuclear forces is understood as both sides' ability to inflict unacceptable damage on one another in retaliation. Now, Soviet military thinkers closely followed the evolution of American nuclear doctrine, particularly in the 1960s and 1970s, and the US concepts of unacceptable damage. So you see references to the McNamara criteria or the Brown criteria and others in Russian military writings. And sometimes you see that they're literally working off the same translations of key books and documents. This history drives a lot of current debates. For example, even today, Russian analysts write about the McNamara criteria of 400 warheads and the subsequent US planner reduction of nuclear deterrence criteria to 200 warheads, the Brown criteria, being sufficient to inflict unacceptable damage in retaliation. And so if you follow the strand of these writings and these authors, and if you believe them, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, there were Soviet or Russian efforts in military planning institutes to decrease what was understood commonly as unacceptable damage levels. This was intended to save costs and also facilitate nuclear force reductions under arms control agreements. And Russian analysts write that the understanding of unacceptable damage also began to evolve from objective measures. So as I noted before, strikes on key targets and the destruction of these targets, to add more subjective ideas about types of damage that would be psychologically unacceptable to a potential aggressor's leadership. So you see this search for a new concept in two ways in Russian military writings. First, military planners like Tsigichko discuss concepts like intolerable or unallowable damage. He calls it недопустимый ущерб. Tsigichko writes, intolerable damage, in contrast to unacceptable damage, which is determined in advance and relatively permanent, is not a constant value. and depends primarily on the price that the aggressor wishes to pay to achieve goals in a specific conflict. However, this price cannot be greater than the level of unacceptable damage or a certain determined limit, which touches on vital interests and the security of citizens of developed states of the West. So for Tsygichko, intolerable damage, this concept that he created, was inherently subjective and relied on a certain civilizational factor. And it sort of went in hand with certain Western notions of casualty tolerance for Western democratic societies. And second, the key concept that has really emerged in Russian military writings over the last decade and kind of has come into its own is this concept of deterrent damage, or сдерживающий ущерб. Deterrent damage first appeared in military thought as part of Cold War efforts by Prudnikov and others to develop deterrence criteria for Russian strategic nuclear forces. You can see this described in certain articles by Russian military thinkers, this idea of trying to work out a deterrent damage criteria or Prudnikov criterion, which would operate on the basis of counter value damage, but not with its absolute unacceptable levels, but with the interrelation of levels of damage, which could be inflicted by the sides on one another, depending on the scale of counterforce actions. So you could think of it, and I quote here, a potential opponent has a hypothetical ability to prevent own damage by inflicting a preventive disarming strike. The more means are designated for employment in carrying out such a strike, the less effective are retaliatory actions of our strategic nuclear forces, and the higher the level of prevented damage. However, the more the opponent increases the proportion of means employed in carrying out counterforce tasks, the greater the decrease of the reserve means he has for realizing countervalue tasks in inflicting damage to our military economic targets concentrated on cities. As a result, while he's attempting to undermine strategic nuclear forces' potential, the opponent has to sacrifice to an extent his own potential of countervalue actions. So you see this concept in writings in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And as I noted, it's primarily related to strategic nuclear forces. But during that first decade of the 2000s, as Russia is beginning modernization of its capabilities, the concept begins very slowly to evolve into an intra-war deterrence concept that could be applied to the employment of strategic conventional systems in the pre-nuclear period of conflict to the limited deployment of nuclear systems as the conflict progresses. In the early 2000s, there was a debate on the pages of military thought about the levels of armed forces that Russia would require to defend itself from an adversary and also inflict unacceptable damage on the adversary, and whether this damage could be understood as modeled via various thresholds in how this type of modeling could be conducted. And at this time, Russian military analysts also associated deterrent damage not only with a conceptual decrease in what constitutes unacceptable damage, but also with the provision of minimally sufficient nuclear potential. Analysts described the resilience of Russia's strategic nuclear forces as follows, quote, "It must be at a level so that the opponent would not destroy it with one massive strike, even with nuclear weapons use. In addition, the remaining potential of nuclear forces after the actions of the aggressor must be sufficient to inflict deterrent damage upon him, which would make further actions against Russia dangerous and disadvantageous to the attacker. The necessary level of deterrent damage and how many warheads are necessary for this is one of the central questions of nuclear deterrence and the sufficiency of nuclear arms." End quote. They further argued that the levels of deterrent damage have declined, noting that even one warhead could notionally be enough, even though in practice, planners usually did not go under several hundred of warheads. You also see General Staff Research Center writings used the concept of deterrent damage with regard to strategic nuclear forces. For example, there's a 2010 article, there's an article where they write that for strategic deterrence at a global level, the quantitative amounts of effectiveness of Russian armed forces, understood as general purpose forces and nuclear forces employed for strategic retaliation, are based on assessments of deterrent damage, which could be inflicted as a result of retaliatory strikes on military economic potential of an adversary. This damage is assessed by the levels of loss of main industrial capital, determined by their direct impact, and additional indicators of results of nuclear strike could include population losses, as well as the time of post-war reconstruction. And you also see writings from the Rocket Forces Academy about deterrent damage. And they understood the concept as unacceptable to the aggressor damage, the preliminary assessment of which forces him not to proceed with an aggressive action. But at the same time, this damage would not be irreversible. So deterrent damage could be called unacceptable, but also irreversible, but reversible. So it could be something that a country could come back from. The very interesting shift in the writings occurs around 2009, and particularly when it comes to analytical work from Burinok and others from the 46th Military Research Institute. And this appears to have been important in developing this conceptual basis for the notion of strategic deterrence to the use of military force that became a part of Russian military doctrine in 2010. And so these writings mainly explore the series of writings and books, as other colleagues have argued, explore how Russia could use strategic conventional capabilities or non-nuclear deterrence capabilities, but also discuss to some extent concepts related to limited nuclear use. So these writings, in essence, are a shift from the exploration of what deterrent damage looks like when it comes to strategic nuclear forces, because they shift away to the broader spectrum of strategic deterrence capabilities. So in a 2009 article, Burinok and others write of the need for a new term that could be used in pre-nuclear deterrence because the use of unacceptable damage is very excessive. So they argue of the need to introduce the concept of deterrent damage in this regard, which they define as strictly dosed damage inflicted by nuclear or strategic non-nuclear means on objects of vitally important infrastructure of the aggressor state. They note that this concept could be viewed as a projection of the category of unacceptable consequences on the scale of military phases of conflict. So again, the upper bound of deterrent damage is unacceptable damage. They further write, quote, "The introduction of the deterrent damage concept allows us to discover certain principal aspects of strategic deterrence to the use of military force, connected to the possibility of employing sequential increases of the level of damage to the aggressor depending on his reactions to previous deterrence measures, as well as with determining of the level of damage inflicted to any potential adversary, taking into consideration national values, opportunities to defend national interests, and the sensitivity of society and individual persons towards possible losses. In addition, there's the possibility of determining the impact of informational psychological means on the mechanism of deterrence on the scale of phases of development of interstate conflict." So note this sort of discussion of subjectivity and the callbacks to the earlier writings by Tsigichko and others about these subjective notions of damage and how you could engage in strikes of specific targets and critical infrastructure to kind of get at this decision-making factor in your opponent. And so, as I noted earlier, it can be very challenging to sort through the definitions of deterrent damage in Russian military writings. And even Russian analysts themselves write of sort of this inconsistent definition of deterrent damage as they work through it. For example, for number one, in the 2010 government document, Foundations of Nuclear Deterrence Policy, deterrent damage and unacceptable damage are, according to articles, the same and understood as damage that is greater than the benefit which the aggressor expects to receive as a result of using force. We know from the text of the 2020 Foundations document that the deterrent damage concept is no longer present in that document. Two, Strategic Rocket Forces Academy books on deterrence defines deterrent damage as unacceptable for the aggressor damage, the preliminary assessment of which compels the adversary to deny to engage in aggressive actions. But at the same time, the damage is not irreversible. So we noted this earlier, sort of Strategic Rocket Forces classical definitions of how to use that term with their specific mission. And again, in works by 46Tsni and others that look broadly at sort of the modeling of strategic deterrent capabilities to include conventional weapons, they understand it in the concept of strictly dosed damage inflicted by nuclear or strategic non-nuclear means at objects of vital importance to the adversary. So again, targeting and specific objects that you would target kind of come into play over here, especially if you want to achieve this subjective factor. And so the common thread between all of these three is that deterrence damage is the type of damage which could be inflicted on an adversary in response or as a result of deterrence through the use of force, and the degree of which is assessed by the adversary as unacceptable and compels the adversary to not initiate or continue military actions. In other words, it's central to escalation management or interwar deterrence. In turn, deterrent damage could be objective or material, so involving normative and percentage of various target sets that have been struck, or subjective, and both need to be considered. And there's also potentially the need to consider how different members within a coalition perceive damage subjectively and how their impacts in terms of leadership decision-making and populations also impact on one another as kind of a crisis or a early conflict progresses. Writing suggests that the key challenge with this, and you see this also in General Staff Academy writings, that the key challenge with the concept of deterrent damage is figuring out what are the levels of it and how does your adversary perceive these levels of damage. 46Tsni folks argue that, reflexive control approaches or panels of experts could offer one possible way forward. And so the issue here is that there appears to be no scientifically based approach to assessing deterrent damage levels and no basis on how to, quote unquote, dose deterrent damage. And you see a lot of military writings struggle with that aspect of it. For example, 46Tsni analyst Tserin Dardzhiev has written of the need to understand deterrent damage in the context of also non-military means. And he defines it as minimally sufficient damage inflicted on a subject during which one can achieve the decrease of his abilities to form a military threat to a level, guaranteeing the achievement of Russian military security. And so he looks at it primarily as something that would balance military and non-military means, given sort of that the realm of the threats to the Russian Federation lies also in that non-military means sphere. And then you see other military institutes like the 12th, which focus much more on sort of the nuclear mission set. They think of their own kind of ways to approach the damage discussion, given that they do research for the strategic rocket forces. And some in the 14th and the 4th and the 12th propose new concepts like de-escalation damage with regard to subjective damage as part of escalation management. And so if you look at even present day Russian military writings and articles in Military Thought and other publications, this damage debate continues to this day when it comes to various capabilities. And this notion of subjective damage evolves as Russian military thinkers contemplate the changing nature of warfare and what's needed for much more successful strategic deterrence. And I think we should expect that as capabilities evolve, as doctrine evolves, as capabilities get more precise, and as the Russian military is able to target much more precisely and with a greater number of capabilities. And there's a continued interest in the role of non-military means and the role of subjective approaches. This debate is going to keep pace, and it's something that we definitely need to track. Thank you so much for your time.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Anja. A very interesting presentation you made. It was, I have to confess that it's not the easiest thing to comprehend, to me at least. So I would like to ask a short question. Could you briefly please summarize the main changes which has happened in this concept of damage management in Russian thinking, according to your research?
Sure, thank you. I believe I sort of stated this also at the top of my presentation. So the key thing is that we've shifted from the concept of unacceptable damage in the context of strategic nuclear forces toward concepts like deterrent damage. So we've gone from a specific focus of the damage conversation in the context of primarily strategic nuclear forces to discussions of damage when it comes to the whole of the strategic deterrence capabilities, to include nuclear forces, general purpose forces, and other strategic deterrence forces that are non-nuclear. So that's the one aspect of it. The second aspect is, I think the discussion has evolved from objective damage, so strikes on targets, towards more combination of subjective damage in it as well. So the idea is that if you target certain aspects of critical infrastructure, you'll also be able to affect and impact the decision-making cycle of your adversary and the population. And so that's the other part of the subjective part of the damage discussion. And so we've progressed in that as well. And so I think as strategic deterrence evolves in terms of capabilities and in terms of theory, this damage discussion is going to be very critical to it, because the idea of how to dose damage during different parts of the conflict and as part of strategic operations. And that's, I think, sort of the key change to here.
Okay, thank you. I would like to have a very short question on you. You mentioned that this deterrent damage concept was removed from this 2020 document. So what do you think, how you interpret, what is the reason? Is it because there is discussion on its definition, or what is your interpretation for why that's the case?
That's a great question. And I'll be honest, I'll be the first person to say that I have not seen the 2010 version of this document. It was not public, it was classified. I've only seen references to certain quotes from the document in articles by Raul Dugin and others, so authors from the Strategic Rocket Forces Military Academy, who quote it in some parts very extensively. And so that's sort of what I rely on here. And that's why I think I said reportedly, because I haven't seen it. But I think a lot of the changes that I understand have happened from the 2010 to the 2020 version also have to do with the fact that the 2020 version is a public document. It essentially became the articulation of Russian nuclear doctrine as they were preparing, the military doctrine revisions. And I think a lot of it was also intended for, to some extent, public consumption or public diplomacy by the Russians about their nuclear forces. And so I think the language that you see there is much more of a tightening and kind of careful sifting of the language so that there's less misperception on part of, Western actors specifically. So that's my interpretation. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. There are not much questions in the chat, so I think I'd like
return to them. We can return to the questions that raised in the end of the discussion.
Yeah. So I'd like to invite our next speaker, Dr. Edvard Geist, a policy researcher at the RAND Corporation. His research interests include Russian nuclear weapons, artificial intelligence, and civil defense. His latest publications include Armageddon Insurance, Civil Defense in United States and Soviet Union, 95-91, and RAND publication exploring the role nuclear weapons could play in deterring Russian threats to the Baltic states. Edward, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I should preface my remarks by saying that the contents of this talk are solely my own views and not those of the RAND Corporation or its sponsors. So how much can we divine about Russia's contemporary nuclear strategy from that of the USSR? Given the mystery surrounding the Kremlin's current plans for its nuclear weapons, analysts are incentivized to make the most of whatever materials are available. The temptation to try to fill in the gaps in our knowledge of Russian strategic thought with Soviet-era material is compounded by the wealth of new sources about Soviet nuclear policy that have become available to Western academics in recent years. Between the declassification of Western intelligence reports and Soviet documents from Russian archives, as well as Russian language memoirs and secondary accounts, Soviet nuclear strategy is far less of a mystery than it was just a decade ago. But for better or worse, these insights into the USSR's nuclear weapons policies are of scant help making sense of Moscow's strategic policies today. Recent Russian accounts of the evolution of their country's nuclear strategy, including some by practitioners, emphasize discontinuity from Soviet-era theory and practice. The most important of these discontinuities is that while Russian nuclear strategy is designed with the goal of deterring both nuclear and conventional threats to the Russian state, Soviet officials rejected sτερежевание, or deterrence, as the basis of nuclear policy. Instead, they aspired to what a leading post-Soviet Russian strategic theorist, Yuri Pachotnov, dubbed the survival strategy. This scheme sought to ensure the continued existence of the Soviet state no matter what its enemies might do, and avoided running afoul of Marxist ideology. But even in the mid-1960s, many in the Soviet civilian and military establishment recognized that it outstripped Soviet technological and economic potential, if one even accepted that it was physically possible in any case. But due to a lack of consensus among Soviet elites about what might replace it, the survival strategy hung around until the 1980s. By contrast, almost immediately after the collapse of the USSR, Russian strategists embraced sτερежевание as the justification for their country's nuclear arsenal. And over the last 3 decades, they have cultivated their own distinctive, homegrown counterpart to Western deterrence theory. Officially, Soviet strategists rejected most of the premises of Western strategic theory. While Soviet leaders eventually accepted the principle of assured retaliation, they were extremely skeptical of the kinds of metaphysical sorts of deterrence theory that were outlined by American strategists such as Thomas Schelling and Herman Kahn. In particular, the Soviet Union denounced limited nuclear warfighting concepts and the notion of escalation management. As the decades passed, however, Soviet thinkers warmed to the concept of deterrence even though they lacked a neutral terminology for it. And after the collapse of the USSR, the post-Soviet Russian government swiftly embraced sτερежевание for the purpose of its nuclear weapons. And today the term is deeply incorporated into Russian policy and strategy. Marshal Sokolovsky's 1962 book of Военная стратегия, military strategy, articulated the survival strategy, which had crystallized out of post-Stalin debates within the Soviet civilian and particularly military leadership about how to navigate a world of nuclear missile weapons. Sokolovsky's book disclaimed the possibility of limited nuclear war and escalation control. But this was not because of a belief that nuclear war could necessarily be deterred, nor a deduction from a belief that nuclear war was unwinnable. Instead, Soviet military planners envisioned fighting tactical and theater nuclear campaigns simultaneously with strategic nuclear exchanges. And while they contemplated a brief period of nuclear conflict limited to certain theaters or kinds of weapons, they assumed that the war would soon expand to all theaters and forces. These planners hoped that nuclear and conventional weapons would complement each other. For instance, by using tactical weapons to create openings in NATO lines that in Germany, that Warsaw Pact forces could then exploit. While supporters of a nuclear war-winning capability existed within the Soviet defense establishment, most notably exemplified by Vladimir Tolubko, who is commander-in-chief of the Strategic Rocket Forces between 1972 and 1985, discussions of controlled nuclear warfighting, and particularly the use of nuclear demonstrations for signaling, only occurred in a very few circumscribed contexts. So bizarre and fanciful as this vision of an all-out nuclear war fought primarily for military ends might appear in hindsight, it's less of an aberration than it seems. And in fact, US nuclear war planning just a few years earlier in the 1950s had actually followed very similar premises. In part due to ideological shibboleths about that the peace-loving Soviet government would never initiate a war, Sokolovsky's book insisted that the Western imperialists would start the conflict, but that the USSR and its allies would immediately seize the initiative and take the conflict to the adversary. Detecting an imminent or incipient attack, Soviet forces would immediately launch an упреждающий or preemptive strike to blunt the enemy offensive. Despite admissions that thermonuclear war would have an unprecedentedly destructive character and might, quote, wipe entire nations from the face of the earth, unquote, Soviet ideologues insisted that the USSR and its allies would not just survive, but prevail in World War III. The ideological considerations that made the survival strategy so compelling to Soviet military thinkers in the Khrushchev era were similar to those that bolstered Tukhachevsky's forward defense strategy in the 1930s. The survival strategy, however, was always controversial, and critics both inside and outside of the Soviet military immediately launched attempts to introduce an acceptably Marxist-Leninist formulation that thermonuclear weapons had made war unwinnable. Although Soviet analysts did not couch the problem in terms of deterrence and strategic stability, they quickly realized that their country's nuclear strategy defied reality. And while much of the Soviet military establishment remained committed to the preemptive survival strategy well into the 1980s, the USSR needed more credible alternatives. And Soviet officials took inspiration from an unlikely source, their arch adversary, Robert S. McNamara. While initially enthusiastic about the possibilities of damage limitation, the Secretary of Defense had soured on ballistic missile defenses and counterforce over the course of the 1960s. And as his researchers had determined that those could not be made cost effective. To counter pressures from Congress and the military for ever larger nuclear stockpiles, McNamara publicized the results of some of those analyses, drawing attention to one of the key measures of effectiveness, assured destruction. While McNamara himself and Westerners ever since have called this idea of strategic nuclear deterrence by threat of punishment assured retaliation, the Soviets latched onto another aspect of his formulation, that of unacceptable damage. And this concept and its derivatives remain central to Russian discussions of nuclear strategy and deterrence, although the Russian concept and its role in defense planning are very different from how McNamara meant it in the 1960s. Traditionally, Soviet strategists equated unacceptable damage with the destruction of the few hundred largest US cities. But where McNamara's assured destruction was a measure of sufficiency distinct from employment policy, Russian military writings suggest that their nuclear war plans are designed to subject an attacker to unacceptable damage with retaliatory strikes. While Soviet analysts used a different approach than those in the United States to calculate how much was enough to inflict unacceptable damage, they came to similar answers. Alan Enthoven's methodology did not bother to make criminological inquiries into the psychology of Soviet leaders. Instead, it sought out the flat of the cost curve beyond which additional attacks on urban industrial targets made little marginal difference. This led to a conclusion that 400 1-megaton warheads would be sufficient for assured destruction. In the Soviet Union, Andrei Sakharov suggested that 500 1-megaton warheads would be enough to inflict unacceptable damage upon the United States. In both superpowers, the estimate of nuclear forces needed for assured destruction followed a similar downward path after the 1960s. Defense Secretary Harold Brown told Congress in the late 1970s that holding the largest 200 Soviet cities under threat would suffice for central deterrence. Late Soviet and post-Soviet Russian sources commonly give a figure of 150 megatons delivered as enough to meet the unacceptable damage requirement. The 2003 book Ukrasheniye Yadra characterizes this figure as a reference level and implies that it may have been employed by Soviet defense analysts. Yuri Trutnev specified 300 500 kiloton warheads and noted that a safety margin was added in Soviet practice to account for uncertainty, and recent Russian publications indicate that this is probably still done. Another key concept shaping the evolution of Soviet and Russian nuclear forces emerged during the 1960s, that of paritet or parity. Despite ideological commitment to the preemptive survival strategy, the Soviet plan for force development in the early 1960s does not seem to have envisioned procuring strategic nuclear forces numerous enough to match those of the United States. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, however, Washington enjoyed an enormous numerical advantage in strategic weaponry and compelled the USSR to make a humiliating withdrawal from Cuba. A few months later, Soviet leaders approved the development of the UR-100, or NATO reporting name SS-11, a light ICBM ill-suited to serve either as a preemptive counterforce weapon, as it was too inaccurate, or as a survivable deterrent, as its flimsy silo offered meager protection against multi-megaton US warheads. Instead, the UR-100 was the first Soviet ICBM cheap enough to be mass-produced. The Soviet leaders were determined to attain numerical parity in strategic nuclear forces with the United States. They perceived this gambit as a success. Throughout the early Cold War, Washington had demonstrated its determination to maintain larger nuclear forces than the USSR. But in the 1972 SALT Treaty, it acknowledged Moscow as its equal. Ever since, quantitative parity has remained a cornerstone of US-Russia strategic nuclear arms control negotiations. While the military significance of quantitative parity is often dubious, its psychological importance is hard to discount. Numbers are easy to understand, and equal numbers work to establish equitable status. While Russian deterrence strategy only crystallized in the 1990s after the collapse of communism rendered old Bolshevik ideological shibboleths moot, some of Russia's current approach to deterrence can be traced to the late 1980s. Desperate to break the stranglehold of the Soviet military-industrial complex over the USSR's stagnating economy, Premier Gorbachev declared that henceforth the Soviet Union would only procure forces sufficient for defense, rather than lavishing resources upon the military the way his predecessor Leonid Brezhnev had. The principle of dostatочность, or sufficiency, has remained the basis of Russian procurement policy ever since. In part, this has resulted from extrinsic factors. With the partial exception of the early 2010s, the post-Soviet Russian military has always existed in a constrained budgetary environment. But chastened by the experiences of the Soviet collapse and the governmental and economic chaos of the 1990s, senior Russian officials seem to appreciate their resource limitations and try to budget sensibly in light of the extensive list of potential threats they perceive. Thanks to the non-involvement of the Russian legislature in the development of the Russian defense budget, procurement policy can be designed with less lobbying from regional and commercial interests. Russian defense procurement appears to be designed around explicit theories of requirements to a much greater degree than its US counterpart. The Russian president and the Russian Defense Council define what is sufficient, after which they spend their defense budget accordingly. This figures directly into the second principal contemporary Russian strategy inherited from the Gorbachev era, that of asymmetry. Senior Russian officials are very fond of characterizing their policies as asymmetrichne odvety, or asymmetric responses. The asymmetrical response principle is closely associated with Russia's most important civilian strategist, Andrei Kukoshin. In the late 1980s, Kukoshin played a key role in an unprecedented civilian military committee set up to counter Reagan's strategic defense initiative. Many Western specialists scoffed at the technical feasibility of what the American press quickly dubbed Star Wars, but the Soviet government and military perceived it as a very real threat. While Reagan's conjectural space-based missile defense While parts of the Soviet military and defense industry advocated trying to match Reagan's conjectural space-based missile defense systems in kind, it appeared doubtful that the USSR's economic resources and technological base would prove adequate for this task. Along with Americanologist Sergei Uzmobyshev and others, Kukoshin advocated an alternative strategy that would seek to develop countermeasures to cancel out SDI. These would both include means to neutralize or destroy defenses, as well as novel kinds of strategic delivery systems that could punch through the layered defenses planned for the Strategic Defense Initiative. In large measure, the Soviet asymmetric response sought to dissuade the United States from trying to actualize SDI in the first place. Already in December 1985, Premier Gorbachev told his American counterparts at a summit in Geneva that if the US did not desist, his country would field countermeasures that, quote, will be effective, though less expensive and quicker to produce, unquote. Within a few years, dozens of major research and development efforts into potential asymmetric responses were underway in the USSR, some of which were quite expensive. While over a decade passed between the adoption of the asymmetric response strategy and the introduction of the first weapon based upon it, the Topol-M ICBM, it has played an outsized role in shaping the modernized Russian nuclear forces. First flight tested in 1994, the Topol-M's carbon fiber body is designed to be resistant to the kind of directed energy missile defense weapons envisioned for the Strategic Defense Initiative. The single warhead Topol-M sought to assure retaliation without fueling an arms race. Armed with a single warhead, the ICBM had negligible counterforce potential, but stood to be highly survivable in its road mobile version and have high penetration against possible missile defenses. But compared to other asymmetric responses in clandestine development, the Topol-M was almost pedestrian. The US withdrawal from the 1972 anti-ballistic missile treaty was not only prompted Vladimir Putin to withdraw Russian ratification of the START II agreement, under which all land-based multiple warhead missiles were to be banned, it also sparked a revival of a Soviet effort to build a hypersonic glide vehicle to evade US missile defenses. First flown unsuccessfully in 1990, flight tests restarted in 2004. While these efforts resulted in a chain of failures that almost resulted in the cancellation of the program, in the late 2010s, Russian specialists successfully tested the system, now named the U-71 Avangard. Putin announced proudly in his March 1st, 2018 speech that this system proved that Russian science and industry could produce qualitatively new weapons lacking Western analogs. So, despite participant testimony and declassified documents, the role of limited nuclear use in Soviet employment planning remains ambiguous even decades after the Cold War ended. Officially, the USSR simply rejected Western theories of escalation management and controlled nuclear war. And whereas in the early 1960s, the Soviet military writings assumed that strategic and theater war would take place simultaneously, both with large-scale use of nuclear weapons. By the mid-1970s, Soviet strategists had taken inspiration from their Western counterparts to envision a war with a distinct theater nuclear phase preceding intercontinental nuclear exchanges. They also began to contemplate the possibility of a war in Central Europe that remained wholly conventional, which was a tantalizing prospect to them given relative Warsaw Pact advantages, as well as a growing acknowledgement of just how much damage even a very limited nuclear war might cause. But for the most part, Soviet military thinkers still scoffed at the notion of protracted, limited nuclear wars on either a theater or a strategic level. Escalation control, in their view, simply could not be relied upon. Once the nuclear threshold was crossed, one would face a possibly inescapable prospect of escalation to general nuclear war. According to leading Russian strategic thinkers, such as Andrei Kukoshin and Yuri Pechatnov, post-1991 Russian thinking about limited nuclear use differs qualitatively from that of the Soviet Union. The unraveling of the USSR and the resulting precipitous decline in Russian conventional military power compelled Moscow to reconsider its position on limited nuclear employment. In 1993, Boris Yeltsin renounced Brezhnev's pledge not to use nuclear weapons first in a conflict. Freed from their former ideological shackles and desperate for remedies to Russia's increasing military weakness, Russian military thinkers reevaluated the merits of Western strategic theories. And along with capitalism, the Russians finally embraced deterrence as the objective of nuclear strategy. In 1998 to 1999, Russian civilian and military officials made a number of far-reaching decisions that continue to shape the country's nuclear policy. These choices laid the foundation for the strategic modernization that came to fruition over the next 2 decades. The Topol-M ICBM, Borei-class SSBN, Sineva and Bulava SLBMs, and the Iskander SRBM were all approved as replacements for aging Soviet-era systems, although all of these took considerably longer to reach deployment than originally envisioned. Simultaneously, Russian officials embraced limited nuclear use as a potential remedy to surmount their military's readily apparent weaknesses. A 2001 account of the policies adopted by the Russian Security Council in 1998 commented that a not insignificant role in our nuclear deterrence policy was played and will be played by operational, tactical, and tactical nuclear forces and means. A meeting of the Security Council conceptualized the place of these means in the general system of nuclear deterrence. If previously tactical and even operational tactical nuclear weapons were considered first and foremost as an amplifier of the combat capabilities of general purpose forces, as Marshal Ogarkov spoke of in his day, today their military political mission approximates that of strategic nuclear weapons, in which they act exclusively as a component of nuclear deterrence integrated into an overall system, unquote. Russian officials explicitly signaled the shift toward increased reliance upon nuclear threats. In 1999 to 2000, updated defense policies and military doctrine declared that Russia reserved the right to use nuclear weapons, not just in response to a nuclear attack, but also in retaliation to large-scale aggression with the use of conventional weapons in situations critical for national security. So as to drive this point home, in the Zapad 99 military exercise, Russia exercised coercive, limited use of nuclear weapons. According to a 2003 Novaya Gazeta article, the exercise envisioned a scenario in which NATO attacked Kaliningrad. In retaliation, Russia launched 2 nuclear weapons into Western Europe and 2 into the continental United States using long-range air-launched cruise missiles. Stunned by this attack, NATO forces retreated, allowing Russia to emerge victorious. Western analysts disagree about the role of non-strategic nuclear weapons and limited nuclear employment in contemporary Russian defense policy, but it cannot be denied that recent Russian language publications about nuclear strategy differ substantively from those written before 1991. Escalation control, a subject which was reportedly taboo except among a subset of the Soviet General Staff in the 1980s, is now one of the primary subjects of debate, with different writers advocating alternative concepts such as deterrent damage and de-escalation damage to operationalize limited nuclear use. Ensuring the survivability of retaliatory forces, a topic which Soviet analysts fretted about incessantly in secret, but avoided acknowledging in public, is also a recurring theme in unclassified publications. In the last few years, Russian officials have also become more forthright discussing their deterrence policies, most notably with the publication of the document on the principles of the state policy of the Russian Federation on nuclear deterrence in June 2020. While the Russian Federation inherited the USSR's nuclear weapons, its nuclear strategy is largely a post-Soviet invention. From the standpoint of the old Soviet survival strategy, Russia's contemporary nuclear strategy is largely unrecognizable. Its objectives and assumptions are qualitatively different. The Soviet Union aspired to survive a nuclear war while assuming that such a war could not be kept limited. Contemporary Russia, by contrast, makes sτερежевание, or deterrence, the objective of its strategy, and makes threats of limited nuclear use a key enabler of deterrence. As Pechotnov commented in 2010, at present, the Russian Federation follows a conception of deterrence that is based upon the ideas of mutual assured destruction and limited nuclear warfighting. A robust assured destruction capability serves as the foundation that makes lesser threats, either conventional or nuclear, credible. Moreover, while the survival strategy was always aspirational, despite the USSR's immense defense expenditures, contemporary Russia now possesses all the necessary technological enablers for its nuclear strategy. The uncertainties that call that strategy into question now lie outside of the Kremlin's influence, namely whether potential adversaries will play along with Russian strategists' assumptions about escalation control. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. First, there is a question from Ray Finch. I'd like, Ray, that you could make the question yourself. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yep. Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry. Great. I appreciate both the presentations. Very interesting. My question, kind of tongue in cheek, not really, but I'm just kind of curious as to the Russian idea of unacceptable damage. And my question dealt with, would the Kremlin leadership, or could the Kremlin leadership perceive, large, widespread violent protests throughout the country as some sort of unacceptable damage, and could they direct their response to their what they perceive as their Western enemy?
Did you get the question that was perhaps for Anja mostly, but the both could answer?
Sure. So I think as you noted yourself, your question is a little tongue-in-cheek, right? We're talking about sort of these concepts of unacceptable damage that have to do much more with strategic nuclear forces and retaliation,
right? Sort
of the upper bounds of violence, if you will. And so I think, as we all know, the Russian military views the idea of protests, potentially widespread and potentially violent protests, as a key issue of domestic instability. And it's obviously written in the Russian military doctrine. So I think this sort of the key issue of what happens and when that happens, and if there's a crisis preceding it, particularly a crisis with, Western partners, is something that kind of would need to be monitored. But I think if you look at Russian writings on escalation management, the key idea there to some extent is proportionality. So you wouldn't want to escalate beyond sort of the level of conflict that you think would be enough to deter your partner. And so the idea that Russia would use, means of violent means to include nuclear means in case of domestic protests is something that I think is potentially could be viewed as unacceptable. by the Russian leadership. But I'd also love to hear what Ed has to say. Thank you.
Right. So I agree with everything that Anya just said. That basically the issue with unacceptable damage is that this is like originally this was really conceived as like this is counter value attacks on like population industrial sorts of targets. And admittedly, there are some Russian writers who have used the term in, shall we say, a very loose sort of way to encompass some of these like limited nuclear employment concepts, but not in the sense of like, oh, well, we're like, they're not going to nuke us because they think a color revolution is going on. At least I don't think they are. Right. But thank you.
Okay, but thank you for the reply. I mean, just kind of a follow on that if the situation domestically in Russia were to become, I mean, I don't want to paint too dark of a picture, catastrophic, do you think then the Kremlin might use their great information sources to somehow, would they be tempted to, perhaps spark a conflict externally to redirect that domestic dissatisfaction toward an external enemy? Thank you.
Well, I suppose that it's a possibility that you can't rule out, but there's the issue of if they're losing control domestically, and keep in mind sort of like the Russian history of this is that they think about sort of like the events of 1917 quite a bit, where the external conflict is not necessarily a obvious way to try and shore up domestic support. I'll put it that way. It's like the idea that, oh, well, like we're going to start an external war to try and like solve our domestic political problems. I think that this is counterintuitive to most Russian defense thinkers. Now keep in mind that, of course, it's like if the Russian president like loses his mind or something, like, well, you can't rule out the possibility, but it's not the first thing that I would expect. I'll put it that way.
Okay,
I would agree with that. I would also add that you need a certain number of personnel to persecute conflict, as well as maintain domestic stability. And so I haven't looked at the numbers, but I would suspect there would be some discrepancies between the numbers that you would need to do both at the same time.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to raise a question about concerning the calculation of the damage and which is acceptable. Does it only assessed towards the adversary, or has the Russian or Soviet theorists have calculated what the possible use of nuclear weapons cause to their address? In what happens to the formation or state which launches the strike, whether it's retaliation or the first strike, whatever. And I would broaden the whole thing that how does the status, the perception of status of Soviet Union or Russia inflicts effects to the calculation, what comes to the parity with the nuclear weapons in total with the in the global level?
So are you referring mainly to like the political effect and reputational effects, or to the physical effects of engaging in nuclear use?
This kind of political perceptions, they affect to the realistic, let's say, amount of the nuclear weapons, or just the damage calculation and let's say the technical approach to the question?
So I can certainly speak to the technical piece of it. The contemporary perceptions of, shall we say, third parties in these discussions of like limited, like dose damage is something that I'd be very interested in if Anya has seen something like that, because I don't recall like having seen anything in the Russian literature that specifically refers to like, well, there'll be these reputational costs with third parties, and like maybe we should like try and assign some numbers to that. But Sigichko back in his memoirs talks about Soviet research starting in the mid-60s, where they were trying to calculate what the physical effects of nuclear use would be, say, in a theater war in Europe. And it rapidly became apparent that these sort of like dreams that, oh, we're going to use these tactical nuclear weapons and create openings in the NATO lines. We're going to drive all these like lead line tanks through those lines, and we're going to like head out to the English Channel. It rapidly became apparent that if you start using nuclear weapons in Europe on any kind of scales, like the entire place is just going to be covered with fallout, and like no one's really going to be going anywhere. And it's not a way to create any kind of usable military advantage. And apparently he refers obliquely to assessments, or apparently done the General Staff, that basically found that like trying to fight this nuclear war in which you're trying to use the nuclear weapons for military effect and then exploit it was just not going to work. But at the same time, for these ideological reasons, there wasn't an ability to renegotiate the declared doctrine on the basis of that. And so there was this very strange disconnect between a lot of the technical research that the Soviet analysts were doing, which found logically that the survival strategy just was not technically feasible, and then an ideological incapability to acknowledge that. And so today, the general trend in the post-Soviet period has still been to sort of go down in terms of controlling side effects. There are discussions about how, well, you need to avoid collateral damage because too much collateral damage is too escalatory. The extent to which they believe that the collateral damage is predictable and controllable is not entirely clear. Or it's also possible that the Russian nuclear weapons effects experts and the people who are thinking about these limited nuclear use concepts are just not the same people, and they may not really be talking to each other. I have not actually seen any direct evidence of a recent discourse going on there, for what it's worth. But Anya, do you have any insights into any of that?
Sure. So I think we have seen Russian writings in the past about sort of the challenge of generally assessing when you are in the thick of conflict, what would be the level of unacceptable damage inflicted on Russia, and sort of how to do that, the challenges of doing that in practice, again, when you're potentially in a conflict that involves nuclear weapons, and how to get to a political decision by the leadership to actually, engage in a retaliatory strike. And I think we've seen some of those writings, and I think they get to some extent at the sort of the technical ability of the military to actually be able to assess that, to be able to give a recommendation to the leadership. I think there are other concepts that relate to the resilience of forces in the theater, and the sort of the sufficiency of forces in the theater when you're actually in a conflict, primarily conventional forces that have to do with kind of another aspect of it. I think when it comes to, there are, as I think both of us have noted in our presentations, military institutes that sort of speculate about concepts of geopolitical distance and what would happen with great power status if, in case of nuclear use, so kind of nuclear war or large scale war, and kind of the implications that would have for the economy of great powers. But you see that as sort of speculations and studies that kind of are aimed at much more kind of philosophy, I would say, not necessarily kind of practical implications. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Yeah, and there is...
Yes, there is a question from Mike and Kristin. So Mike, would you like to ask the question yourself so that everyone can hear? Please.
Sure, I'd be happy to read it. Thank you for this wonderful panel. So my question is that in thinking about deterrence, it's important we parse some of the differences about escalation management following nuclear use. There's beliefs on whether or not nuclear use can be controlled or whether limited nuclear war is possible, and differences in thinking about escalation management between conventional war and nuclear war. And those begin to emerge pretty clearly in late 1970s as Soviet planning starts to form around the independent conventional war option, and that starts to come to the fore. So is it safe to say that current Russian military thinking on non-nuclear deterrence dates strongly back to this period as both the US and USSR begin planning around an independent conventional war option, assuming the nuclear escalation is quite possible, but it is not inevitable?
So I personally prefer to periodize things a little bit differently because of just how differently these theories that you see starting, like in the Ogarkov period, of having this independent conventional war in which there's these ideas about like reconnaissance strike complexes and things. But the theory was not that, oh, well, the Soviet Union's allies will be acting from a position of marked conventional inferiority. It's like all through the end of the 80s. In fact, I wish Lester Grau was here with us because he actually wrote this very insightful article about this 30 years ago, about the emerging thinking in the 80s about how to fight this conventional war that the Gorbachev era military theorists were making. And then my impression is that the post-Soviet Russian military thinkers got blindsided in the early 90s by just the complete collapse of Russian conventional military power, and ended up having to rethink about how they would go about this because they were no longer in a position of being at least evenly matched conventionally, which is what the thinking in the 1970s and 1980s seemed to be built around. But I think that there is a case to be made. It's like, okay, 1977 in a variety of ways actually is a breaking point, for instance, because it's also like Brezhnev made his Tula speech that year, and the Western analysts didn't know what to make of it because he said nuclear war was unwinnable. And then at the same time, like the Soviet military doctrine still said these things that it had been saying since the 50s about that implied that nuclear wars were winnable and the Soviet Union would somehow try and win it. And the dissonance sort of drove people like Raymond Garkhoff to really dig very deep into the available sources, trying to make sense like, well, what's the actual policy of like the general secretary is saying this one thing, and then, like the general staff is saying this other completely incompatible thing. Is like, where are we coming from? And so the dissonance was real. It's like apparently Brezhnev was off on his other page from the military leadership, and the general staff people were starting to think in ways that were considered very unacceptable 2 decades before. But where we draw that dividing line is really it's a matter of judgment, I think.
Thank you. And then there is another question from Catherine. Could you please make the question for the whole audience?
This is Kristen. Did you mean me or?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. Thank you, Anja and Ed, for your really interesting presentations. I wanted to return to the issue that you touched on earlier, Anja, about the 2020 deterrence document that was made public, and could you say a little bit more about why you think that the concept of unacceptable damage was more or is more suitable for public consumption than the concept of deterrent damage? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kristen. It's a great question. And I wish I knew the real answer to that question, which I suspect is much more bureaucratic in nature. I suspect that if one is writing a document about how one plans to use nuclear weapons, and the document is written primarily for an external audience, especially at a time when a lot of people are paying attention to Russian nuclear doctrine and how it's evolving, one probably wants to minimize the number of terms you're using so that the language is as clear, as precise as possible in the nature of kind of bureaucracy that produces that document. So that's kind of the one thing, is sort of the bureaucratic explanation of how the document was drafted. The second is just also, speculation on my end and my personal opinion, that I think there was a lot of confusion with the use of zadanный ущерб in the 2003 document that was kind of put out by Ivanov and others, and with a discussion of nuclear employment in this idea that you potentially would lower the threshold, if you will. So I think I suspect what they were trying to do is just to minimize the number of terms that would minimize the amount of speculation, and kind of to stay close to the traditional doctrinal language. But again, that's just my assumption. I'd love to hear what Ed's thoughts on that are.
Right. So like my read of some of these articles, like in Strategic Stability, and you talked about them. So I like basically there are these guys at which of the SNI is it, the de-escalation damage? Is it? I'm trying to remember. Is it 12? Anyway, 12. But basically there are different writers like Berenik and Pechatna have been putting out this like, oh, the idea. They have their formulation of it, except like their formulation of it in their most recent writings seems to be different from the one in like the 2009 article. And then there's these alternative concepts like for de-escalation damage. And my impression is that this is just still an ongoing debate, that like they wouldn't still be arguing about this if they'd actually settled on something. And they seem to be recycling some of the same terminology and like looking, I think there's a parallel in the Western case, right? It's like, so historians like Frank Gavin have grown very, very confused about like what was flexible response back in the 60s. And the reason that they get so confused is that term was always somewhat ill-defined and was regularly redefined over the course of the 1960s and afterwards, to the point that it became, I would argue, almost effectively meaningless, because someone says it and you don't know what they're talking about necessarily. And I feel like a lot of the Russian terminology is evolving in the same way. Is that, well, like we have this nice phrase, it sounds good, or at least we've gotten used to using it. And so it gets repurposed and it doesn't have a constant meaning over time. And sometimes that's what you want in your doctrine. That's how you paper over your bureaucratic uncertainties. Other times that's really bad to put in your doctrine because you actually need to be more on the same page. The unacceptable damage formulation, like it does date back to the Soviet period, although I don't have any confirmation that they actually used it in like an official doctrinal document at that time, but they were definitely talking about it even in the late 60s, early 70s. And so you don't have to deal with this issue that, well, like apparently there's like not agreement about either exactly what it is or whether it should be the formulation. And so you want to keep that sort of thing out of the official statement that you're putting out for the Westerners, which is such like the amount in just the last 2 years or so that they put out is like, because even like I remember having conversations with Kristen and with Anya a few years ago before this came out. It's like they are a lot more forthright than they used to be. And this must be some sort of intentional policy change on their end. Exactly what's motivated it, I'm not entirely sure. Perhaps some of you have a better idea than I do. But yeah, just the fact that we have that document, I think, is in itself remarkable.
So maybe I can respond. Just because. Oh, do I have a camera? Yeah, no, I was just super intrigued by the use of the term as well in this document that was published, and well, evidently also intrigued by the fact that it was indeed published. And as far as I recall, but it may be that I recall that I'm mistaken, but as far as I recall, it has been the Zadany Ushched, that term has been used in the military doctrines, in the official military doctrines up until this point. So it was actually, so this 2020 document actually contained, oh, I'm sorry, the change came in 2014 in the military doctrine, but the 2010 military doctrine also contained the Zadany Ushched term. So that was part of the reason why I was confused, but it may be that I'm not right in recalling this, but my understanding was that this signified some kind of change, and I think that you're entirely right, Anya, in indicating that, you know, the explanations for this might as well be bureaucratic as lying elsewhere. But I also think that in itself is quite interesting in terms of tracing who it is who participates in the deliberations of the content of these documents, and you know, who is it who gets their say in determining what precisely this should look like. But thank you for your insights into this.
Just to clarify, I think you're absolutely right. And it was my kind of, there's obviously Zadany Ushched language in the doctrine that has to do with the sort of the strategic nuclear forces operation. And you're absolutely right on that time. I was referencing to sort of the language in the 2003 document that was put out that kind of caused a lot of controversy, that talked about not employment in the strategic nuclear forces operation, but at kind of other levels.
Okay, thank you. And then we have a question from Fredrik Westerlund from Sweden. And I think during the day session, he hadn't the opportunity to make questions. So I read it for you here for all. We have so far discussed deterrence and damage from the West Russia perspective, but would current Russian concept also be applicable to China? China is a very rarely openly discussed as a potential adversary, but its military power and geographical closeness dictates that it has to be addressed. However, it's a very different society from the US, so would current popularized thinking suffice? It's a very hard question. Fredrik admits so, and if you can elaborate this, please.
I could just start by saying I'm not the China scholar. I don't speak the language, but I have colleagues who do, and I think there's been a lot of writings on the evolution of Chinese thought on escalation management and Chinese views on nuclear weapons and employment. And I think that is a distinct body of thought that I think should be of greater interest to Western scholars as China's nuclear doctrine continues to evolve.
So I read the question as being like, well, what do the Russians say about deterring the Chinese? Is that correct? Is that? Okay, yeah, that's what I figured. So this actually been very interesting, the extent to which both in the Soviet period and after a formal Russian, this is a topic that they tend to steer very clear from for it must be political reasons, right? It's like Russia and China in recent years have been moving closer together. But even in the period, sort of like the dark days of Maoism, when they actually fought little border wars, the extent to which official Soviet documents that I've seen just steer away from the possibility of the nuclear war between the People's Republic and the Soviet Union was very, very conceivable. And yet it was just not discussed. Like the official documents all talked about a potential war with NATO. And that raises the question of okay, well, do they think of it as being a different case for deterrence? They definitely don't perceive quite the same sorts of threats from China as they do from the West. Because the theory with the West is the West poses this advanced technological threat, this aerospace campaign, maybe they could have conventional disarming strikes, that sort of thing. Well, from China, you don't have to be worried about that same sort of thing. It's the issue with China is that they have an enormous conventional force where Russia can't actually field a large enough conventional force to try and counter it. And how would you stop it if you saw this some sort of Chinese invasion brewing? And it is true that there are certain things that the Russians posture in certain places that don't make any sense of their posture toward the West. I'll put it that way. But at the same time, Russia and China say that they're such good friends that they don't need a formal alliance because formal alliances are for people who don't really trust each other. I don't believe that line either, but that's what they say. But it also makes it very difficult for them to acknowledge in any kind of public forum, or even if you have to worry with if you're talking about this internally to leak, and then it's your wonderful friend who's actually maybe not such a great friend that you're kind of worried about now has this document saying that, are you planning to nuke them? It's it looks really bad. So in any case, it's just not, it's a taboo subject seemingly. Even though if you talk to individual Russians in the right positions, many of them seem to take it fairly seriously. So take from that what you will.
I agree with Ed that it is a taboo subject. I would add also that to some extent, Russian thinking on unacceptable damage, as we've discussed during this panel, has evolved from this, U.S.-Russian interaction during the Cold War, right? So China wasn't necessarily a part of that interaction. And so in military journals, it is to some extent a taboo to discuss China in sort of those terms. But I think where you do see a discussion to some extent about what Chinese society values and kind of contrast that to some extent, what would be the values in a sort of a Western democratic society is in some language and some of this sort of deterrent damage and kind of societal differences and kind of perceptions of large scale war and how that would be perceived in China versus other countries. So you do see some of that language, but again, it's mostly on a sort of hypothetical conceptual terms and not really linked to the sort of the practical realities of the Russian-Chinese relationship.
Thank you both. I'd like to come back a bit to where, Anja, you started, and that was the definition of the deterrence damage as a physical and moral damage. And now that we have discussed the conceptualizations are based on very much on the kind of developments in the nuclear deterrence, where the idea is that the nuclear weapons inflict physical damage that then have a moral consequences or the implications for the moral authority or the authority in the country. But I would like to ask you, like, how in the Russian debate, the fact that there are strategic information weapons, how does it change, or does it change the kind of calculations of what is counted in the moral damage? If I was able to make the question in an understandable way.
So if I understood you correctly, what you're asking is sort of what are some of these aspects of subjective damage?
Yes, and how the more influence of, or the more bigger role of the cyber and information strategic weaponry make for these calculations of the damage, or is there any major difference in the theoretical discussion in Russia right now?
That's a great question. I think it's a question that we really need to pay attention to, right? As you know, as there's this growing interest in the information warfare and broadly defined in Russian military thought. I think the ideas of subjective damage rely to such a great extent on the ideas of reflexive control and kind of changes in public opinion and interactions with leadership. That I think they are very fluid and understood as very fluid and unstable as a conflict evolves. So I think how you take that part that the Russian military thinks about and kind of add it to the sort of the information implications of a conflict that, you know, the Russian military doesn't necessarily do itself, or, you know, the things like trolls and kind of some of these other things. How do you sync those two? I don't think they've sort of figured that out or kind of have discussed it in practical terms, right? Because I think a lot of this thinking that we see is still from before 2014. And you're seeing kind of this growing interest in how these things work with non-military means, with information. And you see that from thinkers like Tsirin Darjiev in the 46th SNI. But it's still kind of at this very conceptual and theoretical level where he tries to figure out what that level of deterrent damage would be. And I think cyber is understood, to my mind, is only in sort of how the way I've seen written is, you know, to the extent that it inflicts, you know, both physical effects and subjective effects. But I'm not sure that I've seen kind of clear scenarios of the Russians writing about what the sort of the physical effects could be in a conflict. The way, for example, they write about, you know, if we strike things with strategic conventional weapons, they don't necessarily write in the same way about cyber capabilities. So, and I think that's kind of a rambling answer just to say that it's something that I've thought I need to think about more, because you really put your pulse on a very important question.
Thanks. Would you, Edward, like to comment, or would there be any other questions?
Are you asking if I want to comment on the cyber question in particular? Because like I don't really have anything to add to Anja's excellent answer to that.
Okay, that's good answer. Thanks. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, then, thank you for your answers. And I just, we have a few minutes time left, so I'd like to raise a question for the end and turn our eyes to the future. If and when the let's say the new military technologies is more or less operational, what comes to the airborne or land-based or sea-based weaponry, which were, let's say, advertised lately, and how do you see, this is a more hypothetical, but anyway, how do you see this development would and will it be have an effect to the calculation of damage concept and what it means on the other hand to the military strategy? I tried to put it for both of you, this question. What comes to the damage management or deterrence damage or whatever, how does it affect to the concept and what comes to the strategy for especially for the strategic nuclear weapons?
So am I understanding correctly that it's like basically you're asking what impact emerging technologies would have on sort of like strategic nuclear damage criteria?
Yes.
Right. So
sure.
My impression with regards to the strategic nuclear forces is that the Russians have a theory of requirements, which is that the Russian strategic nuclear forces have to be able to inflict unacceptable damage as defined by, like, it's varied apparently somewhat over time, but it's still defined relatively on a relatively high level in sort of absolute terms. I mean, it's like at the very least dozens and maybe, you know, still like a few hundred nuclear warheads detonating. It's like that's delivered. So the idea being that, well, we need 1550 or whatever, however you're counting, in order to ensure that maybe like 10% of them actually make it after a counterforce attack and get through the missile defenses and so forth. And so when Putin talks about, it's like, well, we're making these super weapons. And the idea, my impression is that one of the goals of the super weapons is to try and ensure unacceptable damage will be inflicted without causing an arms race by building things that will go through defenses and not following the Cold War sort of strategy, which is that, well, we just have more warheads. It's like we can't use redundancy to try and ensure retaliation because that will cause an arms race. So we're going to try and invent these novel things and have sort of like a smaller number of qualitatively diverse things on the theory that that will make comprehensive defenses so difficult and expensive to build that the Americans won't be able to do it. So my impression is that the technology will actually, if anything, it will allow the unacceptable damage criteria to remain the same or to go down in terms of like, well, how much is enough in order to ensure unacceptable damage? The question of like, how will the definition of unacceptable damage change? That's sort of an independent matter, right? It's like they could decide, it's like, oh, well, we go from the McNamara criterion to the Bundy criterion, which is one actually detonating. Like if the Russians just decided that they just need fewer weapons to make it, then that requirement could change. But that's independent of what technology is available.
That's a good answer. And just to add, I think in addition to buttressing second strike, it's my belief that I think the exotic capabilities are also intended to sort of derive psychological effects upon the adversary. And I think, you know, this is the reason why, you know, if we believe what some have written, that these are kind of Soviet era concepts that were dusted off for the present time. And so I think that gets into these discussions about subjective notions of damage and what, you know, Western audiences could perceive as being potentially unacceptable in certain situations. But I think sort of the broader phase of your question, if it's on emerging technologies, like for instance, AI and some of these other new things that are bound to sort of have an impact on Russian conventional modernization and nuclear modernization to some extent. I think there's an interesting debate ongoing in Russia about the implications of new technologies and as they're applied to conventional capabilities and what the implications are for that in terms of strategic deterrence, Russian strategic deterrence writ large, broadly defined. And I think as you've seen, you know, Putin's statements about the fact that, you know, nuclear weapons may not necessarily be the end all be all deterrence in the future, right? That it, you know, the importances and the ability to constantly innovate and kind of adapt these new technologies to, you know, military capabilities that are effectively able to deter Russian opponents. And I think that's kind of where that discussion about deterrence is going, to my mind, because I think what you see in the discussion about military modernization is as they kind of continue and finalize, put the finishing touches on nuclear modernization, this kind of evolution of conventional capabilities will continue. And so that's kind of the thing that I'll be keeping my eye on, as well as, you know, the earlier discussed aspect of information warfare. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have used the reserved time for this evening session, and I thank cordially the speakers, Anja and Edward, and good information, good discussion, and in a very, let's say, strategic topic in the sphere of deterrence. So I have to make an advertisement that the seminar, despite of the fact that we are closing up today, it will continue on next Tuesday, the 2nd February, with a keynote speaker from Sweden, and he will be dealing with Russia, realism and fear. And then we go on with one morning session from different perspectives on what comes to the Russian military thinking from the general staff and its meaning in this subject. And then also from Hague, from the Netherlands, what the deliberation and demonstration of deterrence will be. And of course, in the evening, we have our American colleagues, Michael Koffer and Lynn Creech, which will be speaking from the Ogarkov period and the Russian views of assessed correlation of forces and means. And that's the program for the 2nd day of this seminar. I thank you very much. There has been a bit less than 30 participants in the Zoom channel, and some I think 27 it looks like from the altogether, and I don't know at the moment how many people are there on the YouTube channel have been watching our seminar. Can you?
20.
20.
Yeah.
20 people. Yeah, it's a prime time in Finland at least for those persons who have kids in the economy. I thank you very much, all of you attending this seminar, the speakers, the participants and attendees, and I wish you welcome next Tuesday, the 2nd February. Thank you.
Hello.
And good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.